Hello, I'm Jim Turk, Director of the Center for Free Expression, and I want to welcome you to tonight's panel on Trump's War on Truth. I want to begin by acknowledging that the land on which I am speaking to you tonight is the territory of many nations, the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. I also would like to acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Williams Treaty signed with multiple Mississauga and Chippewa bands. I also want to thank the co-sponsors for tonight's panel, and they are the Canadian Association of Journalists, the Edmonton Public Library, PEN Canada, the Toronto Public Library, and the Vancouver Public Library. The return of Donald Trump to the White House has seen an unprecedented assault on all the guardrails and institutions that undergird liberal democracy, the judiciary, the universities, even the American Constitution, which the president said he wasn't sure he was obliged to act in compliance with. Central to this has been a multifaceted attack on media freedom through lawsuits, personal denunciation of journalists, stripping of news organizations of their credentials, and much more. We are witnessing the MAGA movement, President Trump and his enablers attacking the very notion of truth. Tonight, we are pleased to have three American journalists in the front line of these happenings, looking at the dangers and what can be done. And I'd like to introduce our panel. First is Susan Glasser. Susan is staff writer at The New Yorker, host of perhaps my favorite podcast, The New Yorker's The Political Scene, featuring Susan, Jane Mayer, and Evan Osnos, and a wonderful, informative weekly, quote, letter from Trump's Washington, which you can get online. Susan has had a distinguished career before at Politico, at Foreign Policy Magazine, and at the Washington Post. Welcome, Susan.
Thanks so much. It's great to be with you.
Our second panelist is Katherine Jacobsen. She is the Committee to Protect Journalists, the major organization protecting journalists. She's the US, Canada, and Caribbean Program Coordinator. Before joining CPJ as the news editor in 2017, Katherine worked for the Associated Press in Moscow and as a freelancer in the Ukraine, where her writing appeared in many outlets, including Business Week, US News and World Report, Foreign Policy, and Al Jazeera. Welcome, Katherine.
Thanks so much for having me.
And our third panelist is Craig Silverman. Craig is an award-winning journalist and author of one of the world, He's an award-winning journalist and author, and one of the world's leading experts on online disinformation, fake news, and digital investigations. Currently, he's verification expert in residence at the Toronto Metropolitan University School of Journalism. Before that, he was a national reporter for ProPublica, covering voting platforms and disinformation and online manipulation. Craig previously served as media editor at BuzzFeed News, where he pioneered coverage of digital disinformation and media manipulation. Craig trains journalists all over the world in digital investigative, online source intelligence and debunking techniques, and writes a free email newsletter called Digital Investigations. Welcome, Craig.
Thank you.
And our moderator is Julian Sher. Julian is a Canadian investigative journalist, filmmaker, for which he has won numerous awards, author of 8 books, and a newsroom trainer. He was an investigative producer for 10 years, and then a senior producer for 5 years at CBC's Fifth Estate. Now he's a senior fellow at the Center for Free Expression. Welcome, Julian.
Good to be here with such an illustrious panel, Jim.
Well, we're very happy to have all of you. For the audience, the panel is going to have a conversation for 45, 50 minutes. And during that conversation, if there's questions that you would like to ask the panel, there'll be a time for the last half hour or so of the program for a Q&A with the audience. So if a question comes to mind, if you look down at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a button that says, it's a button that says Q&A. So at any time you think of a question, just click on that tab and write out your question. You don't have to wait till we turn to the audience for questions. Just write it as you listen. If you want to direct it to one panelist or to all the panelists, you can indicate that. And when Julian turns to the audience, he'll call on Ange Holmes, who's the coordinator for the center, who will read out the first question, and then they'll answer it and go through them. So please take this opportunity. We have such an impressive group of journalists as panelists. This is a wonderful opportunity to ask questions that you think you'd like to have the answers to. That's all for me. So over to you, and I look forward to hearing you.
Thanks, Jim. Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started right away. This is all being recorded and will be posted tomorrow on YouTube. So if you want to share it with anybody who missed it, please do. Those of us who have been following these issues and people who may have attended previous panels that we've had panels on Putin's war against journalists, on the Taliban's war against journalists in Afghanistan. We had a panel on the battle to cover the war in Gaza. I must admit, I don't think I ever had imagined that we would be having a panel on the war on truth and the war on journalists in America, but that's what it's come to. Let me start by asking all of you, this really isn't the first time we've seen this movie, because we had Donald Trump as president in the first term, and there were some signs and warnings during that first term. Susan, let me start with you. With your husband, Peter Baker, the famed White House correspondent for the New York Times, you wrote a book on the Trump's first term, appropriately called The Divider. And you wrote, let me quote, that Trump made divisiveness the calling card of his presidency. What did that mean when it came to his first war against the media?
Well, thank you so much. Thanks for having me, and thanks for convening us. A heartfelt thanks from south of the border to all of you in Canada. Trust me when I say that this is Donald Trump's attacks are not a majority position here by any means in the country. And also, please, if we need to, will you let us in? You would not believe, although maybe you would believe, given the subject of this conversation, how often there's a sort of gallows humor among us reporters here these days in Washington, and lots of, well, where should we go when it comes to that? But, in all seriousness, in my view, Trump has been actually the ultimate clarifying moment for journalists, as for many other institutions in our society, but certainly for journalists, in my view, it's been a sort of a mission reaffirmation statement. And that is true certainly from day one of the first Trump presidency. We're now more than 9 years into Trump's domination of our political stage. And I would say that attacks on the independence, integrity, and truthfulness of the media have been core to Trump's political persona from the second, he took the escalator down into the lobby of Trump Tower. And, in particular, right as he was inaugurated to his first term, you saw a very concerted and, I would say, really purposeful effort to kind of lay down the covering fire against the media. So you saw him appropriate the term fake news, and I hope we'll talk to Craig about that. I actually mentioned Craig and in our book, The Divider, and in a column in the New Yorker, because people have forgotten this, but the term fake news was first applied to what Donald Trump was doing. And he is nothing if not a master appropriator and thief of others' ideas, and he turns them around on people. So he took the term fake news, which even up to Hillary Clinton was using, to talk about the blizzard of lies and disinformation. And Trump, from even right before he was inaugurated, used this term fake news. He also then began referring to journalists as the enemies of the people. And having served for 4 years covering Russia and the former Soviet Union for the Washington Post a quarter century ago, back at the beginning of the Putin era, that was particularly resonant to me and to anyone who spent even a minute in the former Soviet Union. They know that that term, enemies of the people, is what Stalin used, and in fact was the actual criminal term that got you sent to the gulag or worse, killed in the Stalin era. And so it is the language, in my view, of tyrants and of tyranny. Donald Trump, of course, has been told this many times. That's Trump 1.0. He didn't throw us into the gulag. what's happening in Trump 2.0 with journalists and more broadly, we can talk about it more tonight, but what in Trump 2.0, what you see is a man who is now being enabled and is enabling himself to act upon those threatening words and taking a much more maximalist view of how far he's willing to go within. So we can talk about specifics more, but this is something that's a through line. It's integral to who Donald Trump is.
Thanks. He's building on the things that you exposed in the divider in Trump 1.0. Greg, Susan mentioned that I think few people know that you're probably one of the, if not the first person to use the word fake news. I believe there was an article back in November 2016, and it was about, if you could explain, about false pro-Trump election news that was fake news coming out of all places of Macedonia. Did you ever imagine that the term that you would coin would become a weapon to be used against us?
I mean, the simple answer to that is no. But what's even crazier is if, I actually started using it for the first time in the fall of 2014. This is how,
Wow.
I guess, how old I am with some of this stuff. I was doing a research project at that point where I was looking at how news sites were dealing with rumors and unverified claims. And so I came across these clusters of websites that looked like news websites, but everything they published was false. Political news, science news, and it was about money. They could get ads on the sites, and when they came up with a really great headline that appeals to people's bias or makes them laugh, they could get oceans of traffic from Facebook, and people come and view the ads on their pages. And so I started using it in the fall of 2014, continue using it through 2015. And even as we get into 2016, I was using it when I wrote about a couple of teenagers in Canada who were making money again off of a bunch of fake headlines about Justin Trudeau and Donald Trump, just again playing to people's bias. And, for me, it was this kind of economic, it was really the story of how these big platforms like Facebook and others were changing the information environment. They were rewarding the stuff that was the most extreme and often, the purely false. And it was basically like almost like a slot machine that was paying off for people who knew how to sort of pull the lever well. Because if you hit the right headline, you didn't even need to really have text that made sense. It was the headline that people saw on Facebook and they clicked and boom, you were earning money from that. And so for me, it was really about documenting these dynamics in the information environment and seeing how Trump was really seizing on them so well. He was just an attention magnet on social media and played to that so well. I mean, he is absolutely a master of, I think, modern communication mediums, which you would never expect for a guy who, I think uses a pretty old phone, isn't really great with technology. And yet the messaging that he's able to do and the sort of sense he has for what works and the buttons he will push really works well for him. So the idea that we would go from, what I was seeing in sort of an academic setting in 2014 and then documenting through 2016 to him taking control of the term and turning it back on the media. I remember the press conference after he was inaugurated where he pointed at Jim Acosta and called him fake news. And I mean, my reaction, I was speechless. I absolutely couldn't believe it. And I'm still, at this point, I cringe when I hear the term, but it's still unbelievable to me, the journey that it's taken. But I think the conclusion of it is really just how good he is at taking hold of things. And he has now a very powerful amplification machine, his own world of Trump media and what have you, that they can really get the message out there and they can take control of things. And that is one of the transformations that's happened over the last, 9 or 10 years.
You should have bought the trademark on fake news, Craig.
I really missed out on that, huh?
You missed out. Katherine, briefly, the CPJ, we should explain to people out there, is the Committee to Protect Journalists. It monitors and protects journalists around the world. But in Trump's first administration, you're based in Washington. Briefly, what were some early signs that concerned the CPJ even back then?
Yeah, I think just kind of the very divisive rhetoric that we've already talked about, but really just kind of, I think, trying to undercut all of the media's ability to print fact-based information, really, and this kind of creation of two different ecosystems of alternative facts and then kind of fact-based reporting that we grew accustomed to consuming and kind of taking for granted in a way. And what we saw is that really kind of undermined journalists' ability to do their work, and also kind of fed on this distrust in institutions that was happening more broadly in the United States at the time, and again made it much more difficult for reporters to be able to be taken seriously by the public in many ways. And I think part of what we've been especially concerned about is the trickle-down effect that this has had at the local level in the United States. While there's kind of been a growth of news deserts and other, kind of myriad issues that have plagued media both in the United States and more globally, right? Making it more difficult for local news outlets to stay open. You also have Donald Trump at the same time and all of his associates really kind of trying to poke holes in fact-based reporting and making it more difficult for these journalists to exist in their communities and get stories out.
I should explain, news deserts is a term we use to explain what happens when local news coverage, sometimes in fairly major centers, just disappears because of cutbacks, threats of lawsuits, other stuff. Let me just end this part of our conversation. Towards the end of Trump's first administration, he famously told Leslie Stahl of CBS, he was asked, "Why do you keep attacking the media?" And he said, these are his words, "I do it to discredit you all and demean you all. So when you write negative stories about me, no one will believe you." I mean, those are his words. To what degree do you think that worked?
Yeah, it's very, very effective. And Donald Trump has a long history of, what's known as saying the quiet part out loud, right? Well, he tells us in plain view many of the things, which leads to, I think, one of the terrible paradoxes of this moment for us journalists, which is there's a view among the public, and you'll hear this from supporters of Trump all the time. Well, he's so transparent. His press secretaries will always say he's the most transparent president in American history. By the way, fact check, not true. And on so many of the key issues, like who has a stake, who's giving him money, what are his businesses, and how's that affecting his decision making? No transparency at all. In fact, he's eliminating decades worth of laws, norms, and traditions that go to bringing transparency in government. But because Donald Trump will say things that would be an utter scandal from any other political leader in our country, or frankly, in almost any country, but he says it right out loud, that is seen as a form of transparency, and it's somehow proved to be a kind of an armor and a superpower of his. Like, well, hey, it's just old news. It's just Donald Trump, and it's served the function of normalizing many of the things that are decidedly not normal about Trump's presidency, and specifically, just to your point about the media and what he was saying to Leslie Stahl, something that we quote in the book because I think it's very very revealing. Donald Trump seeks to rip down institutional trust and credibility because that is the most successful way for a demagogue to gain and hold power. And he's actually accompanied those statements with other statements in the course of the 2024 campaign, for example, which echoed things he said as president the first time. He said in different contexts multiple times, "I'm the only one you should believe. I'm the only one who matters. I'm the only one you should listen to." This is verbatim the same kind of statement that we've heard from Vladimir Putin addressing Russian society, for example, in the aftermath of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, which was accompanied by, of course, a flood of lies and propaganda seeking to obscure from the Russian people that this invasion was occurring in an entirely unprovoked manner by their own leadership. But Putin and Trump, and I think many, many demagogues around the world, they seek to tell their populations, "I'm the only one you can believe." And that you look at the numbers. I mean, the erosion of public trust in the media is not started with Donald Trump, but it has accelerated quite dramatically in what you would call kind of this age of Donald Trump. And then just one other little observation to Craig's point about Trump as a media creature and master communicator, because I really subscribe to that, having spent more time than I'd like to admit, as a kind of Trumpologist. The most penetrating comment on this score that we got while researching our book came from a senior official who had served in Trump's first White House for a number of years, who said, that the character Trump most reminded this person of was the boy Mike TV in the Charlie and the Chocolate Factory movie, the original one that I and others on this call probably grew up with, not the more recent remakes. But Mike TV is the little American boy who basically watches television 24 hours a day, and his what he wants from Willy Wonka is to actually go inside the TV and be that character. And I think, wow, what an interesting and important insight into Trump defining the job as a president of the United States as basically watching television all day long in a continuous feedback loop.
Well, that leads us to what I hope will be the bulk of our conversation, which is Trump today. And there's been such a fire hose of things that have drawn people's attention, which we can't get into. The assault on the courts, the immigration battles, the targeting of enemies. But let's look at some of the attacks on media freedom. There's been the continued barring of the Associated Press from the White House press pool because of their use of Gulf of Mexico. The executive order last week to pull federal funding from NPR and PBS. Attorney General Pam Bondi decision to lift the ban on subpoenaing reporters' notes. The weaponization of the FCC, I think they're up to 6 investigations, the Federal Communications body. And right now, I think Trump has launched 4 lawsuits against media outlets. So I want to ask each of you, of all these things, what do you think is the single most dangerous attack? And Katherine, let me start with you and the fact that the CPJ has issued for the first time ever a safety report for journalists in America. So talk about that.
Yeah, not only did we issue a safety report for journalists traveling to the US for the first time, warning them about potential pitfalls of border crossing and the ability of Customs and Border Patrol to access their electronic devices should they request, but we also issued a report about the first 100 days of the Trump administration. And usually we wait more than a year to kind of take stock of what's going on. But as you said, the speed and I think concerning nature of many of these actions led us to publish something much earlier, just to put on record what exactly we have seen in these first 100 days. And as you said, it's incredibly concerning. It's kind of an irregular use of regulatory bodies to go after certain media outlets, which if taken as a one-off might seem like, a well-intended investigation, but when put together in this bigger picture of what's actually happening seems far more nefarious and an attempt to set the tone and create examples out of these large news organizations. And I think that's where a great deal of concern falls, right, is by picking off news organizations that have large budgets and large followings, such as the Associated Press and CBS and ABC and NPR, PBS, right? And doing that at kind of a federal level, it really sets a tone for the rest of the administration and also kind of serves as a deterrent to smaller news outlets that might not have the legal counsel, right, to actually go in and help them or the ability to fight back in any other way, right? And that, I think, is an impact that is very difficult to measure and quantify. It kind of gets into issues of self-censorship and, not being willing and not being able or feeling able to actually pursue stories that are important and need to be told. It's a very uncomfortable calculus.
Craig, good point. Craig, you're the new verification expert in residence at Toronto Metropolitan University. Now, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, although it's so hard these days to keep track of all his titles, but that's one of them. He announced the closure of a hub for fighting foreign disinformation campaigns. How serious is that from your expert point of view?
Yeah, so within the State Department, there's been something called the Global Engagement Center for quite some time. And, in the first Trump administration, he appointed the new head of it. I believe she was a Navy aviator in her background. And so people sort of wondered, okay, so this is a department, it's in the State Department. It is, it looks at documenting and exposing foreign state-based and non-state efforts to kind of undermine not only the US's interests, but also its allies. So it has this kind of global remit. And really under that first administration and beyond there, what I heard from people was that, the work was continuing. They did shift their focus a lot to be very much on China, which sort of aligned with, where Trump saw the biggest concern. And so I think to me, them getting rid of the Global Engagement Center at the end of last year, that really dovetails with other things that have happened with the cuts at the State Department that I think overall are really concerning in that, but it's also, I think, a big surprise for people. I don't think a lot of people, including journalists, had any idea how much journalism was being funded by the US State Department. If you go around the world, you go to Eastern Europe, you go to the Baltics, you go to many, small investigative newsrooms, nonprofit outlets around the world. They, in many cases, had significant portions of their budget that were being funded through the State Department. And these grants did not exert any editorial control. It was money to help these newsrooms because the position of the United States for a very long time was that we support independent journalism. We believe that that is a cornerstone of democracy. And so by funding this and helping this, and also helping fight disinformation, this has been a part of American foreign policy through Democratic and Republican administrations for a very long time. And so I think the ending of the Global Engagement Center, but also the ending of all these grants through like USAID, through the State Department, it's really a complete ending of the US, government point of view that independent, strong, real journalism is a good thing in the world. And so that's the part that I think is the sort of takeaway from it. And on top of that, obviously, their view as an administration is that any efforts to fight disinformation is purely censorship. It seems that in their view, there is no such thing as disinformation. Free speech means, you can say whatever you want, you can manipulate however you want, you can, abuse and deceive through digital platforms and other things. And any attempts to rein that in is censorship. And that's why J.D. Vance went to Europe and lectured Europe, because they're doing a lot to try and fight foreign interference from Russia and other places. So I think the totality, if you combine the ending of the Global Engagement Center with all of the grants and the funding and the fundamental position that has been there since the Cold War and even before it, that the United States stands for independent, free press, independent journalism, and believes that that's a cornerstone of a healthy society and world, that to me is the remarkable thing. And a lot of people realizing that the US has actually been really important to nurturing investigative and independent journalism around the world. Now that the money has been taken away, is I think the shocking thing a lot of folks have woken up to.
Thank you for broadening and bringing in a global perspective, Craig, because, Susan talked about the gulag that journalists face in places like Russia and elsewhere. But as Craig pointed out, I think Reporters Without Borders says something like 3,500 journalists and media workers around the world are at risk of losing their jobs because of those State Department cutbacks. And more importantly, many of them now face gulags, face huge repression and even death because of those cutbacks. Susan, probably more than anybody else on the panel, and probably almost more than anybody else in Washington, you've spent a lot of time in the White House, covering the White House. Of all the things you've seen in the first 5 months, is there one thing or one theme that worries you the most about what we're seeing in this new administration?
Well, when it comes to the freedom of the press, it goes back actually to the introduction here. We now have a president who essentially does not accept the basic contours of our constitutional system, and certainly doesn't recognize or accord any particularity to the role of the independent, critical thinking media in our society. And we're seeing a politicization of everything, and that includes the very idea, challenging the very idea that there is such a thing as a neutral, independent voice in our society. And so, given that it's a multi-front war, I'm glad Craig brought up the attacks on, basically, this is America's soft power. We've unilaterally disarmed, and Russia and China are out there spending millions and millions of dollars spreading their false narratives around the world, including in the United States, including in Canada, as well as Europe. And now the United States has attacked its own pillars of free speech in a way that I think is hard for people to understand, especially because Trump 1.0 didn't do that. So the Voice of America, run by a friend and former colleague of ours from the Washington Post, now in a protracted litigation with the White House over this, but basically is not broadcasting at the moment. Not only that, but here's a news just today. While this lawsuit continues, and I have every expectation that the Trump administration will lose most, if not all, of these lawsuits. But while Voice of America is dark today, and its actual independent, nonpartisan journalists are sitting at home wondering if they have jobs, Kari Lake, the two-time failed election-denying candidate from Arizona, who Trump had tapped to run the Voice of America before he decided to get rid of it altogether, she announced today that actually they're going to replace the Voice of America with the pro-Trump broadcaster OAN and broadcast that out over the VOA's channels.
Oh my God.
This is, I think, a kind of in miniature example of what we're looking at. We're taking America's good faith effort over decades at independent journalism, and we're replacing this with a nakedly, slavishly pro-Trump news feed. And I fully expect that that's where we'll end up, by the way, on the White House press pool, which we've mentioned only kind of vaguely, but I think that's the other thing that I wanted to make sure, we talked about in a clear way, because I think that the red line for the media was crossed very early on here. In fact, so early on that the media did not respond appropriately, did not understand sufficiently what had happened. But when Donald Trump, through the Associated Press, which is literally like the backbone of the American media, and now internationally too, but it's what every small town newspaper, every medium-sized city news organization relies upon for basic, factual, nonpartisan information. He threw out the Associated Press from the press pool, which is basically a century old, and the AP was there when it was founded a century ago, invested a huge amount of money in being there for all of any president's major actions, threw them out for a pure free speech thing. Said, well, if you don't change the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America, that I'm throwing you out. So there wasn't even a pretext of like violating the rules or anything like that. And the rest of the press corps failed to stand up for the Associated Press in a way that would have been full-throated and, I think, communicating the right level of pushback. In fact, there was a news organization here in Washington that used the very same day that Trump made that announcement of throwing the AP out of the press pool, they chose that day to put out a press release saying, well, we are happy to call it the Gulf of America, and we are also taking this seat in the press pool when it's offered. The White House took over the organization and decision making about who would be in the pool from the journalists themselves. So they basically seized for themselves the right, which had existed for a century, of journalists to self-organize so that the most powerful people in the world are not deciding who covers them and who doesn't. I fully expect that if not by the end of this year, then by the end of Trump's first term in office, second term in office, that you'll have all sycophants in the White House press pool, and that it'll be something like the Kremlin press pool. And this was a process that I watched myself occur in the first 4 years of Vladimir Putin's presidency. The Kremlin went from having an independent press pool to having a Kremlin press pool in every sense of the word.
speaking of sycophants, I think it's important to explain to people watching the press pool. If you were, Canadian watching Mark Carney meet with Donald Trump, any major event, obviously not every journalist can fit into either the White House or the White House briefing. So only a few journalists get selected for important events, but that's the public's access to the people in power. Here's an example. One of the new so-called reporters from one of the far-right pundit websites recently asked Trump, this is a literal question, supposedly from a journalist. The question is to the president, asking about the mainstream media. Aren't they proving to be the enemy of the people? Question mark. And Trump answers, I guess they are. Um, that's the kind of journalism we're getting now at the White House. So, given, and we've only touched on some of the dark issues that have been hitting journalists and the public in the last in the first 5 months. Let me ask you then where we go from here. What do journalists and the media, and obviously the public, have to do differently going forward in these unprecedented times? Um, uh, uh, the one of the basic issues is that journalists are supposed to be as objective as possible, as fair and as accurate. And that's what we strive to do. But there has been criticism that you can't be a scorekeeper or a referee if one team isn't playing by the rules, right? This is not a football game or a baseball game if one team is just blatantly breaking the rules. And there have been critics like Margaret Sullivan, the former Washington Post and New York Times public editor who now writes for The Guardian. She criticizes the legacy media for being too tame and too timid. Let me ask all of you, we're all professional journalists. We abide by important rules of neutrality. Do some of the rules have to change? Do we have to engage in new practices without violating our basic principles? I throw that out to any one of you who wants to respond. Now we're getting into some difficult issues. It's one thing to complain. How do we try to fix this? So anybody want to pick up on that?
Listen, I'll say the first thing, which is that there is no simple answer, I think. And anybody who proposes that everybody just has to do this or the media just has to start doing that, I think that's, that's where we're going to be led astray. We're talking about a multifaceted attack on the independence of the media and also on just the practice of journalism and what it means to be a journalist. Your example of that question, being asked in the White House press room, it's not just that it's kind of undermining the idea of real journalism, independent journalism, but it also gives a terrible name to partisan journalism. And there is a long and pretty good history of good partisan journalism. Like you can come from a point of view and you can have a side and a team, but you can also still live in reality and be fact-based and do reporting or, express your point of views in a way that is not just pure sycophancy. And I think that when we lose that ability too, and it's like, no, you're either 100% on board or you're not pure enough for us, then we lose a whole other section of journalism that doesn't actually pretend to be objective, but is actually coming from a strong point of view, but can be rooted in facts. And so, that I guess that adds just to the problem thing. Let me go back to solution, which one, I don't have a simple one. But two, I think, you've got to really look at the challenges that exist. And so one challenge is declining trust overall, not just in the media, but in institutions as a whole in Western democracies. Very big interconnected challenge. No one institution has the solution for it. Another challenge is that in this more decentralized and open information environment, primarily digital environment, which, these are good things to have. There are more voices, more people who can participate. But I think for a long time, particularly conservatives in the US have felt excluded from what was traditional media. And so they grabbed on to the emerging formats and areas because naturally they thought, well, this can be ours. And so you have to look at the fact that Trump has built a very powerful megaphone, that it's interconnected, mutually supporting, and also, features sort of news organizations, but also a lot of people who are in the world of influencers and other areas. And so I think, for me, when we think about that area, my cat just made an appearance here, I think, and there's her tail. When we think about these approaches, I do think, journalists can't just say, woe is me, and blame Trump and what have you. We have to look at our practices and what are the ways that, we might have contributed to a loss of trust. And I think one of the things that comes out a lot from surveys and other things is that people don't actually understand what journalists do and how journalism is done. And I think we've done a very poor job of establishing our approaches and our practices to actually distinguish why we are different than the person asking, aren't they just the enemies of the people? I think there are a lot of people, as frustrating as this might sound, who actually don't necessarily appreciate the differences. And so we have to think about that and how we might better communicate what we do, how we do it, and maybe take some lessons from influencers and other people who don't package things in perfect kinds of segments, but actually seem a little more authentic and raw. And I think there are some lessons and some introspection that we probably need to engage in as much as we are trying to think about, this very forceful effort to undermine journalism as a whole. So no easy solution, but I think some thinking and looking inward that we have to do, and maybe some cues that we can take from people who aren't in traditional journalism about how things are being communicated today. And maybe there are ways and formats and approaches that might make us seem a little more authentic and a little more approachable.
Craig, I think it's appropriate that you talk about the media, how we should look at how we contributed maybe to that lack of trust, just as the black cat crossed your screen, right? Very well timed. Katherine, the CPJ has, spends a lot of its energies giving advice to journalists in Mexico who face assassinations, journalists in Asia, or other places where there are autocracies or dictatorships in fighting back. What advice? What are you trying to do to help journalists in America facing really a situation that's unprecedented?
Yeah, so we have a lot of safety training material that journalists can either access, they can reach out to us, and we can set up safety training for newsrooms. So we do both physical safety training, so thinking about protest situations, or just how to be more situationally aware when going out and, covering your local school board meeting, which, those things are very contentious now, shockingly somewhat, but here we are. And then also thinking about digital safety best practices. So how to make sure your devices are secure, and how to protect anonymous sources, as well as, just kind of thinking more broadly about ways that newsrooms need to, think about who has access to their G Suite and where their servers are, that sort of thing. So we kind of offer that sort of information. And I think what's really important right now is for journalists to realize that the worst thing probably won't happen to them, but it very much could in this environment. And so it's much better to be prepared and perhaps seem overly vigilant than to end up in a situation where you're scrambling to respond to a subpoena or something like that down the road. So.
I just want to be clear on this so people understand. The CPJ is now, I guess you're getting increased requests from American media outlets, be it TV or radio or newspapers, for safety training or safety advice. And this is not for journalists they're sending to war zones. This is for journalists in Philadelphia, Chicago, Miami, or anywhere else.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. I've been at CPJ for about 7 years now. And I remember when I first started calling newsrooms across the country, seeing if they wanted any of our safety material. And there was very much a sense of, no, we don't have problems here. Thank you so much. We appreciate your work overseas. And now newsrooms are proactively reaching out. We saw an uptick both after the elections and after the inauguration in, large groups, especially of nonprofit newsrooms and smaller newsrooms that really just quite frankly don't have the resources to have in-house security like a lot of better financed institutions do. So I mean, which speaks to, I think, smaller budgets, et cetera, but it again leaves their journalists much more vulnerable in a lot of situations. So.
Susan, can you pick up on Craig's point that the place for, Trump calls the media the enemy of the people, and the New York media, whether it's the New York Times or the New Yorker, but you write for a very opinionated magazine. There are deep investigations with a strong political bent. Where do you see the media going forward in the next 3 years? Do some of the old rules have to be changed? Are there new practices?
Yeah, I think the last thing in the world that would be good for us is to become more like podcasters who are not attached to the truth in the search for a fake authenticity that it really is often, paid influencing, and we are the thing being sold our attention. I have a different take on this, which is to say that we spent 8 years, sort of having conversations among ourselves, and the problem has gotten worse, not better. That whether
Mm,
it's the problem of trust in the media more broadly, whether it's the problem of our opponents who don't believe in the nature of our independence, that we still have a reluctance actually to do what I think is fairly obvious right now, which is to gird ourselves to defend what we do and the need for it in a free society, and the failure to be able to stand up and to say the president of the United States is not a king and does not have the right to decide that the Associated Press has to call an internationally recognized body of water what he wants it to be, and that he can enact targeted retribution against them for not doing so. If journalists can't stand up for that, then they probably, in my view, are not going to be very good at defending journalism and the interests of the people that go along with it. We are the stand-in of the people. It's a privilege and a right. It comes, with costs attached to it that have not necessarily been obvious to people. And I think that's a lot of the crisis that you're seeing right now, is that Americans for the first time are finding Donald Trump is taking so many actions that push into institutions far outside the realm of just the federal government itself, that it's forcing it down to the individual level of choices about conscience and, morality and, what is right in our society, in ways that Americans turn out to be, even very privileged Americans, not very good at making. They want to have their cake and eat it too. They want to have their First Amendment, but not actually have to sacrifice to defend it. And you've seen that Trump's genius of dividing, finding fault lines among people. Well, that, look at how he's found actually that the richest people in our society, rather than being the strongest, many of them turn out to be very, very open to the kind of coercion and pressure that Trump is putting upon them. And that turns out to include a number of owners of big media platforms in this country, like Jeff
mm,
Bezos, the owner of the Washington Post, who seems to prioritize his other business interests with the federal government over the historic independence and role of the Washington Post. The owner of the Los Angeles Times is another big business person who I think, hasn't been courted by Trump as directly, but the same point applies. So, again, my view is that we have a very specific crisis. These are all important macro themes we're talking about, but let's actually get concrete and specific and, stand up and say, not only how do we protect the physical safety of journalists covering protests that go awry, or, a bunch of Trump supporters storming our Capitol, that it's not just a question of physically covering a riot, but understanding that targeted attacks, prosecutions of individual journalists may be around the corner, going after news organizations, not just with civil lawsuits, which is a tool that Trump has used to great effect, and again, showing the weakness of some of these media owners and the greed, frankly. Now, again, I don't mean to say that this is unique to America's media companies. When you look, I think, at some of the cave-ins by other institutions in our society, like wealthy, liberal-leaning law firms, who prove to want to have their $7 million a year salaries as partners in these law firms, while going on television and telling people, "Hey, you should resist," but they don't have to. That just fosters the crisis of trust in our society. But, I'll tell you, just personally, I've been attacked by name by Donald Trump repeatedly in his social media feeds, along with my husband. And people are now asking us, it's something I never thought would be the case. Well, do you feel afraid, or, what do you think, will happen as a result of the most powerful man in the world, singling you out? And, again, I just feel like this is a mission critical moment for us as journalists. And so what we actually have to do is get our house in order, make sure, and CPJ and other news organizations, the Reporters Committee for the Freedom of the Press here in the United States, they have sort of the legal lead. There was a meeting. My brother, by the way, is the general counsel of the Los Angeles Times, so he's immersed in this as well. There was a meeting of those general counsel, to prepare for this. But I don't think anyone's really prepared for the scope and scale of legal threats, intimidation, coercion, and the tools of the government that we have not yet seen deployed that we may. And that includes, by the way, the IRS, which is a page right out of the Putin playbook and that of Viktor Orban and other would-be autocrats. So weaponizing taxes, the Justice Department, the FBI, all of these things are potentially coming for journalists. And so let's be concrete about what we need to do.
So, Susan, you're making a very powerful clarion call for a much stronger backbone. You made a criticism of White House people, journalists, not standing up for the AP. Is there not a risk? Wouldn't critics say, if you and other media people increase your voices and the loudness of your criticism, you will prove the point that Trump is making in his demagogic way of you being the enemy of the people? How do you respond to media critics who say, we have to watch it?
Folks, there's one lesson and one lesson only from societies that have experienced a rollback in democracy. The time to defend your rights is before they are taken away. Period. Full stop.
Greg, you're Susan's call to action, which I think everyone would agree with, and many people I think are frustrated that there are not enough brave journalists like her out there. But studies have shown that when you attempt to correct a lie, to fight the disinformation, in a strange and weird way, you often just reinforce some people's wrong perceptions. So if you were giving advice to any American journalist or any journalist around the world who's trying to fight this fire hose of disinformation, and let's use the non-polite word, these lies, how do you do it in a way that doesn't just compound the original lies?
Yeah, the simple thing at the heart of all that is that repetition and belief are connected. The more you hear something or see something, the more it is going to stick with you. And over time, the kind of context that you first encountered a piece of information, the context might sort of be stripped away and it just becomes something you sort of know and it's familiar to you, right? And so this is why, I've mentioned a couple times how effective the sort of media ecosystem that Trump has built around him is. And back in 2016, we talked about it as kind of an alternative media ecosystem, but it's been moved to the center. And that is one of, I think, the great achievements that has happened for Trump over the last 9 or 10 years, is the great expansion and ongoing expansion and moving to the center of what was at one point sort of the upside down media world, or the fringe media world. All of that has been brought into the center and into the mainstream. And so, one, if you're trying to deal with falsehoods, the first rule is minimize repetition. So that's one part of it. But also, I think you have to kind of look around you and realize the repetition engine is going no matter what you're saying. And so I think, one of the part of it is also the realistic piece of this, which is that people often sort of denigrate fact checking because they say, oh, you know, if you correct something that Trump said, like that's not going to change the mind of a Trump supporter. And that's 100% true, but that's not the goal of fact checking. Like, and it's also not necessarily the goal of journalism is to take someone with a, you know, hardened belief or strong belief and instantly through one article or one report change their mind. If that's the bar we set for ourselves, we're in big trouble because repetition and encountering of information, you know, we have to make those work for us as well. And so I would sort of say, one, minimize the repetition of the lie in the actual piece of journalism you're doing, but also how are you sort of continuing a narrative over time that presents the accurate information in a way that is not just sort of a tic-tac, oh, this is wrong and this is wrong, but actually presents a narrative of what's real and what's really going on. That is actually more powerful for the average human being, is them feeling like they're understanding an actual narrative overarching thing. Because again, I think Trump has set a narrative very well, which is that the elites are corrupt, the media is corrupt, they've failed you, they've let you down, you know, they've undermined the whole country, and now we're going to make it great again. And that means signing on for everything I'm for because everything therefore is bad. And so it's hard to just sort of give like one, if someone's writing one article, sure, we could talk about, you know, not repeating the falsehood, focusing on what's true. Is there a larger narrative here? But it's really about a concerted effort, you know, to be pushing back with the facts, but also facts within a narrative of what's really happening and what's really going on that helps someone make sense of it. Because Trump has a very simple narrative. We end up communicating a lot of things in a complicated way because the world is complicated, but he's made it very simple for a lot of folks. And I think that's actually even the bigger challenge than the individual lies here and there, is that all of them feed a very simple narrative that appeals to people.
And on that point, I want to flag to people, we're going to open up the panel to questions from the audience. So if you haven't already, please type in your questions in the Q&A box. And Ange, in a moment, will start off some of the questions. I just want to ask any of the panelists, Katherine, Craig, or Susan, any last points that haven't been raised you want to make before we go to questions from the audience? Anything burning? You've all been quite eloquent and frankly a little bit frightening, but in a good way, I think. Okay, let's start with the questions. Ange, if you could read out the first question and let us know if it's addressed to a particular panelist or to all of us.
Yeah, the first question is from Joanne, and Joanne says, this is, I think, to everyone. It's clear that Trump is a bully. World leaders seem incapable of standing up to him. How does that affect his popularism? What is preventing leaders from standing united and spurring his style of leadership?
All right, who wants to tackle that wider political issue of not just journalists? Anybody? Don't be shy. Susan, you've had some international experience and you know some of the international political leaders. How do you rate the world's reaction to what the questioner is calling a bully?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's, you know, that's Donald Trump's style. It has been, I guess, ever since he was, you know, on the playground in Queens growing up. I think part of what is the dynamic that's happening since Donald Trump on April 2nd announced his Liberation Day tariffs is that you have countries no longer having the opportunity to sort of bob and weave and dance around it and sort of avert the full confrontation with the bully. And, you know, this time, unlike you could argue a lot of his threats in the first term, he's hit bone, you know, and I think that's really what's happening with China to a different extent in a different context with Russia, that Donald Trump's bluff quite possibly is at risk of being called. And, you know, I guess that goes back to my point also about the journalists, which is to say that, you know, we all know that if you give bullies a little bit, they ask for more, more, more. At a certain point, a bully provokes a fight that the others who are the victims of his bullying have to win in order to stop the bully. And I think we're quite possibly reaching that moment in some of these areas. It certainly seems to me that China is prepared for a real confrontation with Trump, that the Chinese society has the ability, for a variety of reasons, to withstand more economic pain than the US economy, that we're all going to be losers in the sense that we all exist in the global economy. But I think the bullying lesson is an important one. And I think about the psychology of Trump all the time because, frankly, so much now in this imperial presidency revolves around the psychology of the leader. And that might be the most un-American thing of all.
Anybody else want to pick up, or do we go to the next question?
I mean, I'll just add that I think it was interesting this week with Mark Carney meeting with Trump and the sort of tact he took, which was, and some people might say, oh, he's being too solicitous. He's being, he's indulging Trump too much. But, the reality is, I think one of the weaknesses that Trump has is he's so interested in approval, even though it seems like he's not. If you flatter the guy, there's probably a lot you can sort of get away with to a certain extent with him. And so I thought Carney was like trying to walk this line this week where, he had to obviously stand up, but he also had to try and put things in a way that could have some alignment with Trump. And so, the thing that stood out to me was Carney he appealed to Trump's, business background and real estate background. He said, that sometimes some properties just aren't for sale. And Trump said, yes, that's true. That's true. And he's like, well, the people of Canada have told me that's the case with us. And I thought, that was an interesting way of pushing back, but it was also done in like trying to frame it in Trump's world where there was like, this because you're a smart guy who's experienced in business. And so this mix of like, I don't know that the 100% just sort of like going after Trump all the time is necessarily going to work, because his lesson is you hit me, I hit you back twice as hard. And it's going to come to that point where people are going to have to, stand up on that. But I also think there are ways to kind of get what you want with him when you can coach it in a certain amount of flattery or in seeming like you're complimenting him when you're actually telling him hell no. And we'll see how far that might get for Carney, but it's an interesting tactic that I think other world leaders are sort of trying to do to a certain extent.
Interesting. I've been called many things, but it's the first time I've ever been called an owner of Canada, when Carney said that he had spent the elections talking to the owners of Canada, and then I realized he meant us. All right, let's move on to next question, Ange.
Yeah, the next question, an attendee asks, they say, Susan, your most recent political scene podcast focused on how Trump is using the presidency to get rich by hobbling any parts of the government that are reasonable for rooting out self-dealing from public life. Is this just a continuation of what some other presidents have done, or is it really unprecedented?
Great question.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, I think that, this question of the self-dealing, the grift, it's integral to understanding, what Trump and those around him are all about. Absolutely true. We have a long history of political corruption in this country. It knows no party, Democrats, Republicans. It goes all the way back, and is, don't want to say Donald Trump invented this, but I will say that the scope, scale, breadth of his willingness to outright monetize the American presidency, to abolish the guardrails that have been in place, especially those that were set up by the US Congress and subsequent leaders after Richard Nixon's presidency. Donald Trump is essentially, smashing that edifice of accountability that we've tried to put in place around presidents in particular, aided and abetted, of course, by the Supreme Court, which declared the U.S. presidency essentially to be truly an imperial presidency in the historic immunity decision that was issued last year during the 2024 campaign, meaning he can never be prosecuted essentially for many of these actions. So now you have him getting rid of ethics rules, flouting them, eliminating the public integrity section at the Justice Department, which prosecutes crooked politicians, outright sending his sons around the world to make business deals from the same business leaders, from the same political leaders he's going to be meeting with in the Middle East, setting up these crypto businesses extraordinary things, telling people to spend millions of untransparent, untraceable dollars on crypto, on a meme coin, and saying he's going to have dinner with the people. These are all remarkable things. And in terms of the scale of the corruption, it's something truly new in the annals of the American presidency, even though, the goals and the aspirations of this kind of crookedness were there before. Remember, family members, whether it's Hunter Biden or Billy Carter, back in the day, many of them have traded off their presidential father or uncle or sorry, or grandfather even. They've traded off the name of the president before, but to have the president be the beneficiary of the crooked scheme while in office, that's something that I can't recall seeing.
The questioner mentioned Susan's podcast, and we'll put a link up on the CFE webpage when we post a video of this so people can subscribe if you haven't already subscribed. But to Susan's point, the New York Times recently had an amazing investigation on the billions being made by the Trump family in cryptocurrency. And I guess if I can build on a question to all of you, I think almost any American, even somebody who wasn't following the news, would know about Hunter Biden and the alleged corruption connected to Ukraine. And yet here was a major investigation of billions of dollars, and as Susan pointed out, of a sitting president who is benefiting and his family. And yet I don't even think many people even watching this Zoom conference read the story or know about it. So why is it that that some of the points that you're raising, Susan, don't seem to be resonating the way Trump was able, as Craig said, to use his amplification machine?
The flood the zone with shit was the famous Steve Bannon line, and we are fully flooded. So I'm very sympathetic. I mean, it's my job to follow this, and I can't follow every detail of it. So, I understand why it's harder and harder to have these things land, but that doesn't mean it's any less important for them to be documented and for this work to be done. I'm truly grateful for the work of, Eric Lipton and others at the Times who've been exposing some of this. And, the answer is not less, but more of this reporting is
Keep it up. All right, next question, Ange.
Yeah, the next question is from Yvonne. Yvonne asks, I have a question about the youth. How are we able to start to convey good journalism to the youth? I teach many young adults and older teens, and one of the things they all agree on is that they cannot trust any source of any source anymore. What can we do to teach the youth on how to discern truth from fiction / real fake news?
Craig, why don't you start with that, since one of your jobs is teaching youth?
Yeah. So, I think we do need to actually have some formalized education that is, integrated not just in 1 year, not just at a certain age, but we think about building it through the curriculum. There are countries like Sweden and Finland that have actually put a lot of effort into thinking through this. And so one of the starting points for it is that one of the things you don't want to do is say to them, hey, just read traditional media, or here's a bunch of good news outlets and here's a bunch of bad news outlets, because the idea is to actually enable them to have the skill to do this for themselves, and for them to be able to think about one, getting their mind in a frame where they're not just mindlessly scrolling, but actually trying to engage their mind of thinking, well, what is the claim here? Where is this information coming from? Where might I be able to find more information? And then equipping them with basic skills for searching so that they don't end up just in a reinforcing rabbit hole. Because, one of the pieces of news literacy advice for a long time was, well, hey, be skeptical and then search around and see what you can find. But it's very easy today to take skepticism and be like, well, I'm skeptical of anything that, the Globe and Mail reports. And to take that skepticism and have it unconsciously create search terms where you go searching and you just end up reinforcing that skepticism you have. And so the skill is really about the thinking and the mindset piece of it, of understanding the dynamics of this information environment, how easily it is manipulated, but then also equipping them with, reading and thinking about things in sort of like a claim oriented process, and then having them do what's called lateral reading in a way where they actually seek out, more reliable sources. And the good news is, like, it's doable, it's teachable, there are models for this, but it is not well integrated into school systems. And it's something that we really, I think, need to put a priority on in a lot of countries, because we can't assume that everybody just knows how to do this well. That assumption, just because somebody's young or, oh, they've been on devices their whole life, it's not like that. We have to actually train ourselves a little bit, because it's very easy for any of us to grab onto something that's false or misleading if it aligns with what we really strongly believe or feel. We are all potentially going down that road. And so it's not about young or old or smart or stupid. It's really a skill that you got to learn.
Let me just interrupt the flow. Susan has a hard out. She has to leave in about 5 minutes, undoubtedly to write another powerful piece for the New Yorker. So, Ange, let me just ask you, the other panelists can stay around a little longer. Are there any questions specific to Susan that she could answer in the next 4 minutes?
Sorry, I'm not seeing ones that are just specifically only for Susan in the.
Okay. So let just take one of the next questions that seems most appropriate, and I'll ask Susan to lead off the answer before she leaves. Try question number 3, I believe.
Sorry, who is it by?
I'm not sure.
Oh.
I just looked at it quickly. But choose any question you think that Susan can address before she has to go.
Okay. Yeah, sorry. With Congress ceding its power to Trump and with the uncertainty of the judiciary's willingness to fulfill its responsibilities, the other factor historically that has constrained authoritarians has been civil society resistance. Do you think that there is any prospect of this happening in the foreseeable future?
Good question for Susan to go out on.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you for this very robust conversation. It's always great to hear, what others have to say about this, because I think, it's important to have these conversations, first of all. And actually, I feel like this is a relatively optimistic note to end on, at least from for me, in the sense that, look, there is enormous strength in our civil society, and for every law firm that's caved in, of course, there are examples already of people pushing back and successfully, for universities that kowtowed. You also had, I think, a real sense of kind of momentum shifting or dam breaking when Harvard decided to push back in a very full-throated way and to take the Trump administration to court rather than to accede to essentially, the federal government dictating what a private university could do in its Middle Eastern Studies department, and using cancer research as, the hostage in that kind of a demand taking. So I feel like the message is being received. You can say it was too slow. You can say that people were wildly unprepared in a way for the kind of assault on civil society institutions that Trump came out of the gate with in the second term. Absolutely. It wasn't, much of this was not a surprise to me. And so in some ways, the surprise was that it was a surprise to so many, including those who probably should have known better. I think there will be more damage. I think Trump will even potentially win some of these fights, or even in a very Trumpy way, win by losing, because, when you keep something like Radio Free Asia closed for, some long period of time while it's being litigated for years, you lose all of that institutional capacity. People move on, they get other jobs. But in the end, the source of Trump's power comes from a part of America, but the answer to dealing with his violations of his power also comes from within the United States. And, Donald Trump has always been a minority political figure. He's maximized that, he's leveraged it to the hilt, but he is a minority political figure who is losing popularity by the day. And he was the least popular president in our modern history since polling began. So that means there are a lot of grounds to hope that while damage may occur, it can be mitigated if people organize and stand up, and that definitely includes the independent press.
An excellent way to say goodbye to you, Susan. Thanks so much. And people, we will post on our webpage links to Susan's regular columns at the New Yorker and her podcast. Thank you very much, Susan. Please
Thank you.
keep up the fight. We depend on you.
Have a great evening. Thank you again.
Okay. For about the next 15 minutes or so, we'll take some of the remaining questions for Katherine and Greg to answer. And next question.
Yeah, the next question is for Katherine. Katherine, has CPJ's initiatives and activities changed in any way since Trump won and onward?
Since the first Trump administration?
Yes.
Yeah, sorry, I wasn't sure if it was one or one. Yes and no. I think there's been a lot more focus on our work in the United States, and we've certainly kind of leaned into that. But we've applied kind of the same principles that we have with our global work, and that's really supporting local journalists and kind of taking the same steps that we do with other regional programs, right? So, yeah, and I think the kind of tricky thing about the United States is that the U.S. has long been a very, dependable advocacy partner in a lot of cases. Thinking about journalists imprisoned overseas, we do a lot of work, trying to advocate for more press freedom in less free environments. And it's been a lot more difficult, I will say, with Trump's return. So in that way, we've kind of have pivoted a bit and started thinking about other ways of approaching that. But that's kind of been a longer process, right? And I also think we haven't really talked about the 4 years in between, the first Trump administration and this. And I think it's just really important to understand like that there was this kind of hope that things would be normalized afterwards, and they very much weren't. And for us, I think it was kind of proof in the pudding of what we had all been thinking and talking about during the first Trump administration and even slightly before that. And the problem with trust of media in the United States and anti-media sentiment, as we've discussed this evening, was something much longer that had been in the American society much longer than, Trump was, on the political stage and will continue very much whether or not he is in the White House or not, right? It's here to stay and very much was present under the Biden administration as well.
Thanks, Kat. That's a very good point, Katherine, that obviously we've been focusing on Trump's war on the truth. But as you say, it will outlast him and raises basic, systemic problems right now in the media and in America.
Yeah.
Next question, Ange. Oh, sorry, Katherine.
Oh,
yeah.
no, I was just also going to say, because we published right before the election a report about the state of local media in the United States, which is the first time that we've ever, all these firsts for us, right? But the first time that we've ever really focused on what it's like to be a reporter out in, say, Kansas or Texas or wherever, right? And again, going back to this kind of hope that things would normalize under the Biden administration, what we found in that report, which was published in October 2024, was that very much was not the case at all. So this, again, is a problem that will take decades to repair.
Good point. Next question, Ange.
Yeah, the next question it came in from a couple people. Do you believe that Canada's law against spreading false news, which was declared unconstitutional in 1992, or a similar law should be introduced to prohibit the spreading of misinformation and disinformation?
Ooh, I'll let Craig answer that.
So, I think we have to sort of. I'll say my bias is, I get the willies when I hear about sort of so-called fake news laws or laws that are really about restraining or punishing speech. And that doesn't mean that I think speech should always be free no matter what, and there shouldn't be limits. Our democratic societies have guardrails. That's one of the ways that we can work. We can have free speech, but also have limits on it that create a healthy society for everyone. So it's not that I'm against the limits, it's that the lesson around the world with so-called fake news laws is that they get in and then there are unintended consequences. The risk of them being applied to censor, if you think in your mind, it's like, it'd be great if we could prevent malicious falsehoods that emanate from foreign actors or whatever, and maybe there could be a law to help with that. Well, maybe, but maybe that also that same law might be used in ways that we couldn't anticipate now because a Trump-like figure comes into power and decides to weaponize it to their own interest. And so my reaction is, I don't know that a new law is necessarily the best way. I think building a more resilient society with some of the literacy stuff we talked about, with active government efforts to think about how you can defend the information space without being geared towards censorship. I think those are the things that if we invest in those things and building a more resilient society, a society that thinks for itself, that is able to distinguish information better and navigate a chaotic information environment better, I think that is probably a better long-term thing. So again, my own bias, I hear sort of fake news law or what have you, and I get a little bit, because I've just seen them misapplied so much around the world, and it's very hard to write a good law in this area. So I don't know that would be a solution I'd want us to go for.
And
Let me
to
just
Craig's
clarify. Oh yeah, go ahead, Katherine.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, to Craig's point, we have documented where fake news laws have popped up around the world, and the ways that they have been used to do just what Craig has said, to kind of censor speech, and they're yeah, and I don't think that they were even well intended in many instances to begin with, right? A lot of them came around during COVID as a way to control the narrative of what was being put out there.
Yeah, the general feeling among many journalists and other people is that you can't legislate your way out of a problem. Let me just clarify, especially if we have viewers in the United States or elsewhere, that unlike free speech in the United States guaranteed in the First Amendment and elsewhere, countries around the world, in Germany, it is illegal to engage in Holocaust denial. That is, it's not covered under free speech. In Canada, we have hate speech laws. So you can be prosecuted for spreading what's defined as hate speech. Others point out, as Craig has pointed out, that those laws can be used. There's been criticism of how they've been used in recent protests against the Gaza war. So it's complicated. And I think if I can echo Susan's point, certainly we as journalists feel, regardless of what the laws are out there, our job is to just keep pointing out the uncomfortable truths and use that as the best antidote to hate and lies, and not rely on laws. We have a few more minutes for a few more questions. And
yeah, the next question, an attendee asks, they say, one of the real concerns in Canada is that the Trump administration is going to succeed in extorting Canada to abandon its Online News Act, which requires the major digital platforms to compensate news media for lost revenue. Are you aware of anything that indicates doing this to Canada, and likewise undermining European digital platform regulation at the behest of his new Silicon Valley buddies is likely to happen?
excellent question, Craig. Any insight into that?
I have not seen momentum. Like, I think definitely they would like to see that happen. I think when JD Vance went to Europe and lectured them about being a bunch of, nanny state censors, he was talking about the Digital Services Act and those kinds of things. But, I talked to a lot of people who engage with folks in the EU a lot about that law and related things, and they're moving forward. I don't see them pulling back on that. I don't see the U.S. being able to get the EU to back out. I think similarly, I'm not aware of sort of U.S. based pressure putting having an impact on those Canadian laws. But we do have a new prime minister, and while he's also a liberal who brought that law in, I don't know that that's a big priority for him. And I wonder if that means he just leaves it alone as it is, or I wonder if he might look at the fact that Facebook's refusal to go along with that law has resulted in the blocking of news content across Meta's platforms in Canada, which is a pretty awful situation. And I wonder if the Liberals might actually try to think of a way to kind of get past that. So I don't know that it's Trump that might change things. I do wonder how the law will evolve in Canada, though, especially given Meta's steadfast refusal to engage with it and removal of news from its platforms.
Yeah, if I can just add, talk about censorship, it still amazes me, and I hope most people are aware of this. Facebook, which is still one of the most important sites where people try to gather information of any kind, has banned news in Canada. That is stunning, right? That means if you read an interesting article on anything in your favorite newspaper or radio station or local website, you cannot post it on Facebook and share it. There are workarounds and people hide the URLs, but it just shows the power of these companies and basically an attempt at blackmail. I should also mention, and it's on our website, we had a previous panel about the media in Canada, the death of investigative journalism and the efforts to keep it alive. And one of the points is that Online Act and the subsidies that the government forced Google and the other big tech companies to play have been playing an enormous role. If you're still reading your local newspaper and local media across Canada, a big chunk now, unfortunately, of the staff salaries come from the payments that the tech companies have to make and other companies. So that's how important it is. All right, we have time for one more question, Ange.
Yeah, the next question is from Scott. Scott asks, do you feel it would be difficult to dismantle independent journalism if the public were more engaged and better understood the value of independent journalism in democracy? If so, do you see success stories of how truth and independence in journalism are resonating with the education of our youth / the next generation? Where are the glimmers of hope from the broader public perspective?
Good way to end. Katherine and Craig, where are the glimmers of hope you're seeing in the media landscape?
Well, in the US, I think the kind of revival of nonprofit newsrooms, local nonprofit newsrooms, has been really reassuring to see and really quite heartwarming. Well, maybe I shouldn't say heartwarming, but very hopeful to see, I guess. Because I think that that's where a lot of the problems start, right? When you don't have a journalist in your local community, you don't understand what they do, and no one's covering your school board meeting, but you're just hearing about all this disaster, in DC or whatever. It's much more difficult to feel invested in the news and not just think that it's this big kind of specter far away. And then I also think that just seeing how newsrooms are engaging with different media platforms. I was chatting to one in particular where they were working with like influencers and stuff who they'd trusted and vetted to help spread their stories online on TikTok and Instagram. And I think that's a really interesting way of trying to reach the younger generation and also kind of see the idea that, maybe the anxiety that you get from scrolling through the news could be solved by getting a print magazine. What a nice luxury. And kind of rebranding what traditional media is to something that's like this, information comforting resource in a way versus, just, in opposition to kind of the barrage of information that places like the White House might be putting out.
Good point. Craig, your glimmer of hopes in the media?
I echo the sort of the people who are building small, sustainable, locally focused or vertically focused outlets that are very close to who they consider their audience to be. Knowing who they are, feeling like there is a personal relationship there, listening to them, creating a feedback loop. Those are things that are really happening. And they are encouraging. Now, the difficulty is always scaling it, but the fact that people are doing it is a great thing. And so if I give some shout outs to Canada, I would say the Green Line in Toronto is doing really interesting, very community engaged, focused journalism. There's also a great project that's run by Media Smarts in Canada. They have a teen fact checking network. So they've got teenagers who have been trained in media literacy and debunking. And they are on TikTok and they are speaking in their own voice, in their own way, digging into things. And so those are the kinds of things that give me hope. And I think there are reasons for that. There are real challenges and we have to face them head on and not hide away from them. But there are a lot of people doing interesting things and good things as well. And last shout out I'll give it is there's an organization called Civix, CIVIX in Canada. They've got a program called Control F, where they're teaching teachers across the country how to teach news and media literacy. And so that is a national network where at the high school level, primarily, some of these skills are getting into classrooms. So those are the things that make me feel good.
All right, if you can send those links and we'll put them up on the website. That's a good note to end on. I'm assuming the background that all three of us have is not fake. Those are real books behind us. So as a book author, that's another good source for news. Go
I
read
have at least one of your
nonfiction
books
books.
here too, Julian. I'm going to say
Well,
that.
doesn't have
That
to
is
be
not
my
fake
books.
news.
Just go read books. They're pretty good sources of information. All right, on that point, let me hand it back to Jim.
Well, thank you, Julian, and thank you, Katherine and Craig. It was a really stimulating discussion. I could go on for some time. Craig, could you just mention again, you gave three sources. We'll put them in the additional resources tomorrow, but just for people who are listening, you mentioned Green Line. Could you go through the three of them again, please?
Yeah, so the Green Line for an interesting model of local news. And then there is Media Smarts, which an organization people might have heard of in Canada, but Media Smarts is running a teen fact-checking network in Canada. And then the third organization is Civics, CIVIX, which is a nonprofit that does education around democracy and has a news literacy program training teachers how to teach it in schools.
That really is one of the good news. I mean, there have been a number of small media outlets that have developed. There are some very positive, albeit on a small scale, things happening. So let's hope that will help begin to balance some of the bad things that are happening. I'd like to thank the audience for being with us tonight and to let you know that the center's next panel will be in June 10th, Tuesday, June 10th. And it's going to be dealing with the question is, should political belief be protected by human rights legislation in Canada? There are a few provinces that do it, most don't. It raises a lot of interesting questions, and we have a panel of some of the leading human rights specialists in the country to talk about the pros and cons of that. So that'll be June 10th, 7 p.m. Right here. And videos of all our past programs are on our website. So as Julian had mentioned, the video of tonight's panel discussion will be posted there by midday tomorrow. The website is cfe.torontomu.ca, cfe.torontomu.ca. And along with it, also, as Julian has been mentioning, we're going to post a list of additional resources that came out of the discussion tonight, various things that our panelists have written or talked about, and we're going to ask them to make suggestions for other links for you. So if you want to dig into it a bit more, you'll be able to find that. And I hope if you enjoyed the panel discussion tonight, I hope you'll make it known to those who weren't able to be with us. So thank you again to the panelists and to the audience, and good night, everyone.
Good night. Stay safe, everyone. Stay informed.